Hi, and welcome to the Diamond Report for Tuesday, November 12th, 2019. This is your host, Doug Diamond. I've got some breaking news and information, some one-of-a-kind information that I do not believe you'll hear anywhere but right here. This new information is particularly important to those of us who are in the anti-geoengineering movement. As some of you may or may not know, I'm involved in working with Dane Wigington on his website, geoengineeringwatch.org. as his webmaster and technical person. I'm particularly proud of Dane's information on that website, and it really is the world's foremost authority on climate engineering, aka geoengineering. And if you really don't understand what it's all about, I would invite you to please start there, because this video is going to make a lot more sense if you have a background, at least some knowledge of the geoengineering issue. So please visit geoengineeringwatch.org and start there. Okay, so you're probably wondering, what's this all about? Well, in the last few days, I have learned that there is a direct tie between D-Wave quantum computers and the ongoing catastrophic global geoengineering programs. So let that sink in for just a minute. If you don't quite know what quantum computers are in relation to classical computers, which is what you and I use every day, I have a very special guest who has graciously agreed to come on and talk about this whole issue, named Anthony Patch. Many of you probably have heard of him. We're going to talk science, and we're going to talk quantum computers, we're going to talk geoengineering, and the spiritual aspect of how it all fits together. Now, before we do that, I wanted to draw your attention to a couple of other things first. I am right now on the D-Wave website. And D-Wave is a very well-known manufacturer of quantum computers. Their website is dwavesys, so S-Y-S, dwavesys.com. You can pull up the website and follow along if you like. Just click on the company tab and then click on customers. Scroll down here just a little. The very first customer listed is Lockheed Martin. Now there are 5 companies profiled on this page. Lockheed Martin, Quantum Artificial Intelligence Lab, Los Alamos National Lab, USC, and Oak Ridge National Lab. And if you don't know, Lockheed Martin is a U.S. government defense contractor who is up to their eyeballs in geoengineering patents, and they do the weather modeling for the FAA. Now, the other company that I wanted to take a look at today is Raytheon. Raytheon, as you may or may not know, does the weather modeling for the National Weather Service, as well as NOAA. Now, Raytheon is not listed on the D-Wave website as a customer. However, if you go to their website and just peruse around a little bit, you will see that they are heavily into quantum computing, and in fact have done videos and written articles about that very issue. So you can pull up that website and take a look at it if you want. It's raytheon.com. Matter of fact, I've got one of their videos pulled up here on YouTube. You can find this one. It's called I Am an Innovator, Quantum Computing at Raytheon. Now again, Raytheon is not listed on the D-Wave website. However, we know they're involved in quantum computing, which is just like Lockheed Martin. If you watch this 2-minute video, I think you will glean some very important information. And the sentence that I wrote down here was probably the one that really stuck out to me. When this guy here talking says, you could apply a quantum simulation to biological systems or chemical systems, which of course the geoengineering programs that are ongoing on a global scale are both biological and chemical systems. So going back to the D-Wave website for just a moment, back to Lockheed Martin, I would suggest reading through these few paragraphs on their website that talks about the relationship between D-Wave and Lockheed Martin. You can pause this video and read it if you like, or you can just go to the website and read it. However, who's to say whether or not the information that I'm talking about right now will stay on their website once we bring attention to it? It's hard to say. They may not care. The other point that I wanted to say, though, was that it costs $10 million to buy a quantum computer. And we do know at least one more customer through Anthony Patch's research that China is also an owner of a D-Wave quantum computer. So there's a 6th customer and another one that's not listed. And we do know that other U.S. government agencies are not listed. Google is not listed, but they also own a quantum computer, as does Amazon. So just keep that in mind when you're looking through the website here. Just know that it's not all going to be there, but some information's there, and that's really all we need to be able to connect a few dots. Now, when you spend your $10 million and you buy a quantum computer, what you get as a benefit is a forever upgrade. So if you buy into the quantum computer system at a certain model, then you get the next model upgrade automatically. So if you buy in at however many qubits, then when the next one comes out, you get the next upgrade. So that's a pretty good benefit of having a quantum computer, because you're going to always have the latest, greatest information. And one more aspect of this is that you have to keep in mind that D-Wave quantum computers, no matter where they are in the world, are networked together, sharing information. So let's go to our interview with Anthony Patch now, and let's talk about how specifically D-Wave quantum computers are directly tied to the ongoing global geoengineering/climate engineering programs, and how it's being used to weaponize these systems on a global scale. I think you'll find it very interesting. Hey everybody, I'm with Anthony Patch, a very well-known researcher. He's into DNA and artificial intelligence research, but he's really well known for his research into quantum mechanics in CERN and things like that. And so I just wanted to say hello, Anthony, and thank you for joining me here on the Diamond Report, and just hoping that you can help shed some light on some of this interesting new information that I feel that no one's talking about, and that is that we believe, or I certainly do, believe that quantum computers are controlling the global geoengineering programs, at least to some degree.
Well, thank you for your invitation to speak with you, Doug, and to the audience. And I concur with you. When we look at standard meteorological forecasting that is done with classical computers, that's complex enough. When we look at geoengineering on top of what we previously would have considered to be natural weather patterns and the modeling of those natural patterns, when we look at the man-made patterns that are created on top of that, the complexity of that modeling takes on a much more elevated, I think, perspective from the standpoint of you quickly outstrip the capabilities of even supercomputers to do the modeling that is necessary for the goals of those that are modifying the weather. In other words, they have very specific goals, very specific areas of the earth that they want to affect in certain ways. As we can all appreciate, weather is nothing that is clearly definable, certainly not easy to control, and not easy to predict, even at the natural level. When man is involved in trying to use it as a weapon system, weather as a weapon system, with specific targets in mind, the complexities, what I will call as we go through this discussion as variables, are so complex that you are compelled to move to a quantum computing system. And what we will define is the basics of quantum computing for those that have not really been exposed to it. And then from there, I will explain the difference between classical and quantum computing. And then I will bring in the complexity of variables and how those are handled by quantum computers. The sum total of sort of my introductory statement here for you, Doug, is that what they are trying to do with planet Earth, specifically with the weather, is so complex that it requires quantum computing, and therefore it goes beyond conjecture to say that quantum computers are actually being used in this weapons system and this geoengineering of the planet. So it goes beyond traditional meteorological forecasting. It actually goes to pattern recognition and steering those patterns towards the goals that they have in mind that they're trying to achieve, be they military goals or engineering of the planet for population control, population diaspora, what have you. So anyway, go ahead with your questions, and we'll try to keep it very clean and very straightforward, not real flowery. My thing is I present my live streams to my patrons in the Patreon community is to take the arcane language of science and translate it into terms and explanations that anyone can understand, anyone can appreciate without being condescending about it. It's just kind of distilling down things and making it relevant to our everyday walk of life. So that's really kind of what I do.
I've learned so much from you over the years from that exact reason, and that's one of the reasons I started listening to you, was because you do a great job of translating the arcane and the really difficult to understand to people that don't really have any experience with that type of thing. So thank you for doing that.
Sure.
I think one of the things that I would like to know is that I think people may have heard about quantum computers and that they have this mystique about them that they are totally superior or supreme to classical computers in every way. And would you say that that's actually the case?
Only when you are running a specific test. The recent live streams that you and I have participated in which we've talked about the presentation by Google going back about 3 weeks that they had achieved quantum supremacy over classical computers. Mm-hmm. That supremacy was for one specific, carefully crafted test. When the general public hears things like quantum supremacy over classical computers, naturally, most people would think, wow, they can do everything better than a classical. And that's not the case. We're talking about a very specific, narrowly defined question or problem that was posed to the quantum computer at the same time posed to the classical computer. And the time frame for the resolution of that problem for the classical computer, which is a transistor-based system. So when you hear classical, those are transistors. When you hear quantum, you're talking about qubits, and we'll talk about qubits in a few minutes. But the idea is that the classical computer would require 10,000 years to arrive at a solution to that very specific, narrowly defined test question, whereas the quantum computer was able to solve it in less than a minute, thus Google claiming that they have achieved quantum supremacy over a classical computer.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense. I think people that are just getting into researching things like this assume that quantum computers must surely be better in every way. And that doesn't seem like that's necessarily the case.
No, not yet. Not yet.
Now, Lockheed Martin and Raytheon are both defense contractors for the U.S., for the government. And they're both up to their eyeballs, as Dane Wigington from Geoengineering Watch puts it. They're up to their eyeballs in geoengineering and weather modification patents. Lockheed Martin bought the very first model quantum computer that D-Wave sold. And D-Wave has it right on their website. It's verified right on there. You can go look at their site and look at their customers, and it says right there that Lockheed Martin purchased the very first model. Now, if that's the case, and Raytheon also have articles and videos on their website listed as well about quantum mechanics, quantum computers, and so forth. They've done videos on it. They're not listed as a D-Wave customer per se. But if that's the case, are they using quantum computer technology, do you think, for scheduling the weather? Could that be what's going on?
I don't see why they would not use a quantum computer. Again, back to the issue of the complexity of modeling. And I don't mean retrospectively looking at the weather, nor forecasting the weather to say, is it going to snow tomorrow? That sort of thing. What I'm talking about is that they decide that for a military application, as an example, that they want to strike a specific area on the planet, let's say with a hurricane or outbreak of tornadoes or just heavy rain. They want to flood an area. Well, what they're doing with a computer, be it classical or quantum, is to run the variables, take all of the environmental variables that there are. You have pressure, temperature, wind directions, you have the jet stream itself, which we know, we've seen plenty of evidence supplied by Dane Wigington of the steering of the jet stream, and that's typically done by pressure gradients. You have the rotation of the Earth, you have the seasons in that particular area. The point is, you have a lot of meteorological, physical variables that have to be taken into account. And you build a computer model, what I call in silico, in the silicon software and hardware. And in building that model, you take all of the known variables and input that in to create the model, and then you stimulate that model. You do the what if scenario. If we change the pressure, if we change the time of day, if we alter the temperature, if we use HARP, if we use NexRad, things like that, what will be the outcome? Now, in a supercomputer, which is a transistor-based classical system, you can run complex models. I mean, that's the whole reason for building supercomputers, is modeling in silico. But when you get to the point where you want to have a specific target with a specific outcome, that means that there is a huge leap, we can say a quantum leap, if you will, in the number of variables. In other words, the number of data points, the mathematics becomes supremely complex. And this is where quantum computers come in, because we're going to talk about the company that sold a quantum computer to Lockheed. Did you already mention D-Wave, the D-Wave website I think you mentioned?
Yes, the D-Wave website.
I thought you did.
Yep.
So the beauty of the D-Wave computer, and I'm not a salesman for D-Wave, hardly, but the beauty of their system versus other types of quantum computers and different from classical computers is that the D-Wave quantum computers are built specifically for pattern recognition. And they do this in what they call a quick and dirty process, a good enough process. They're not looking for finite exactitude results. They're just looking for good enough results, because the trade-off in doing that is they can increase the processing speed of those models. So you can appreciate in a weather situation, you don't have to have, and I'm being very simplistic, you don't have to have 2 + 2 = 4. All you need is an approximation. And this is what the modeling does, is provide approximations based upon the input of a lot of variables that even a supercomputer, a classical type, would not be able to process in a reasonable amount of time. That which a D-Wave quantum computer can do in pulling in huge data points, complex mathematics, and run iterations, run cycles of models. They'll try one model, then try another model, and they can do that millions of times within an hour, within a couple of hours, depending on the complexity and how many models they want to run. The bottom line is, again, in a simple kind of introductory way, they can run with a quantum computer many, many more models in a very short period of time, as compared to the time that it would take a supercomputer in the classical sense to run those same models if the supercomputer was even able to process as many of the variables that a quantum computer can do. So in summation, it takes many more variables than a supercomputer. It creates, therefore, much more complex models, and it can run many more versions of those models in a reasonable amount of time versus a classical supercomputer. So I'll stop there.
Okay. No, that makes total sense. And speaking of modeling, just to sort of add on to what you're saying, I mean, Lockheed Martin, this is according to Dane Wigington again, Lockheed Martin does the weather modeling for the FAA. And Raytheon, the other company that I mentioned, the other defense contractor, does the weather modeling for NOAA and the National Weather Service. So if that's the case,
sure,
you know, the modeling that they're doing, and then that filters down to even as far down as the local weather people. So that would make sense. What you're saying, it would have to be, it would seem on a global scale, it would have to be connected somehow.
Well, let's look at it this way. When they're publicly acknowledging on their websites, Lockheed and Raytheon, that they are providing services to the FAA and they're providing services to NOAA, those are classical transistor-based computer systems that they're employing for that. That's a low-level modeling. That's just your basic run-of-the-mill forecasting. Even for FAA and for NOAA, the applications of those models is relatively elementary. We're going the opposite direction. You were talking about kind of going down to everyday forecasting. Let's take it back up the other direction to where we're going to the most complex modeling that is possible. And again, the application for those more sophisticated models is in the area of weaponry.
Okay.
Because you want to apply your weapon system in a targeted fashion. You don't want to just blanket an area because you may have what would be considered friendlies, collateral damage, collateral victims. And so the targeting, the steering of the weather requires extremely complex models for that targeting to then be where you want it, when you want it, and not something otherwise. So it's the complete opposite of what people would think in terms of forecasting. We're now talking about steering the weather much like you would aim a laser system or a artillery piece or a missile system.
Okay. So getting back to the quantum aspect of this, you had mentioned qubits. I don't know if people listening will understand really what qubits are. Would you mind explaining what that is?
Sure. If we start with a transistor is a gate, and it allows electrons to flow into the transistor, and the gate opens or closes to either allow or block the passage of an electron. So that's a transistor in its basic sense. A quantum transistor, if you will, is known as a qubit, which is a quantum bit. It likewise allows electrons to move within this qubit. We would consider the qubit to be similar to a transistor in the sense that it's the main component of the quantum computer is a qubit, like a transistor is for a classical computer, both of which are controlling the flow of electrons. Now, what's unique about a qubit with the flow of electrons is that you have electrons not as in a transistor classical where it's moving in a linear fashion from point A to point B with a gate in the middle. What you have with a quantum computer and a qubit is you have a circular pathway of electrons that are flowing in opposite directions at the same time. So you have electrons that are flowing clockwise, and at the same time another set of electrons moving counterclockwise within this processing chip. What that results in is something that is known as superposition, meaning that in a transistor from point A to point B with a gate in the middle, you have a 0 and you have a 1, depending on if the electron is flowing, if it's moving or not moving. You have either a 0 or a 1. That's the basic of binary. In a quantum computer with qubits, and you have oppositely but simultaneously traveling electrons, you now have superposition in which a 0 simultaneously can be a 1, and simultaneously a 1 can be a 0. Now, at first blush, that just seems counterintuitive. But what you have is you have electrons that represent a 0 and electrons that represent a 1. And they both are moving at the same time. And they both are in a position in which they can be the same as the other electron. In other words, because they're flowing in the same pathway, but they're moving in opposite directions, and they're doing so simultaneously, they acquire the characteristics of the other electrons. Now, I won't get too deep into this, but there's something that is called, with fundamental particles like electrons and protons that make up an atom. The fundamental particles of an atom have what is known as spin. And there are 3 different types of spin, but they have a spin to them. And it literally is the particle, like an electron, is spinning. Just like our planet is rotating, it's spinning. Electrons do the same thing. The real definition of superposition is related to the spin of the electrons. And again, I won't get too deep into this, but it is in the spinning of the electron as it's orbiting, just like a planet orbiting, that it acquires this really strange notion, counterintuitive notion, that an electron that is in a state, it is in a spin, let's call it an upspin, it's spinning upward, and it's considered to be a 1. An opposite electron that is spinning down is considered a 0. And as they're moving in this orbit, they can then change their spin and become not a 0 but a 1. And the other that was spinning up, that was a 1, spins down and is now a 0. But as they're in transition, in the change of their spin from up to down, from 0 to 1, it is in that transition phase that they then become 0 and 1 at the same time. It's almost like a halfway point in changing the spin, that they suddenly become the same as their opposite. And all of this is happening as they're orbiting in opposite directions at the same time. That's all happening within this processing chip known as a qubit, a quantum bit. Okay?
Yeah. Okay. That's amazing. I don't think most people have any concept of any of that, really. I think that's new information for a lot of people. So thank you for explaining it. Before we get into the spiritual aspect of all of this, is there anything else that we're missing that we need to know about the science part of this?
Yeah, let's give a little bit of history to what's going on with Lockheed and D-Wave. Because Lockheed is listed as one of the customers of D-Wave, and you mentioned that they purchased the first model, let's start with an extension of our discussion of qubits. In terms of the number of qubits that make up a specific model of a quantum computer from D-Wave, their first commercially available quantum computer that Lockheed purchased, among several others that purchased them for $10 million apiece, it had 128 qubits. The next model, the next generation, was a 512 qubit. The next one from there was a 1024, and then 2048, 2048 qubits. And then the next one that is coming out early next year is a 4096 qubits. So these are generations. And Lockheed, as well as the other customers like Google, NSA, Los Alamos National Laboratory, Volkswagen, and I'll throw China in there too. China has a D-Wave quantum computer. The point is, each generation of computer that is presented for sale by D-Wave, the existing customers, the first customers like Lockheed, they receive an upgrade. So they never are stuck with the first generation. So right now they have what is called a 2000Q, that's 2048 qubits in the quantum computer that they have. That's an upgrade. And every customer that buys a D-Wave quantum computer, likewise, is moved up to the latest generation. And they will all receive that upgrade next year into the 4096, which they'll probably call the 5000, just so that it has an easy number for marketing purposes. But what Lockheed has said as to their reason for purchasing the first model, the 128 qubit, and so forth and so on, is for aeronautical engineering purposes. They typically cite the design of aircraft wings. So this is akin to what D-Wave typically talks about in their marketing as to how their computer operates. They will cite, most often in a public presentation to people who are just learning about quantum computers, they will cite something called the traveling salesman problem. Be it a wing of an aircraft or the traveling salesman problem, these are models. And these models are generated by what you might call the operating system of the D-Wave quantum computer, which is based upon combinatorial optimization. Combinatorial optimization speaks to what I presented a few minutes ago of taking in all of the known variables and combining them together. That's combinatorial. And then coming up with an optimal solution, which is the optimization of combinatorial optimization. The optimization is a good enough solution because we want a solution as quickly as possible. Again, the goal is speed. The speed means that they can run millions of iterations of examples of models, because that's the essence of combinatorial optimization, is building models and changing the models and trying it trial and error until you reach a model that you can then apply in the real world. And that is how they are doing this with weather modification, weather as a weapons system, not simply just forecasting, for the public. This is what is behind, if you will, the Lockheed application, well beyond just their aeronautical engineering of wing design and that sort of thing. Lockheed, as Doug, you pointed out, they're providing to the FAA weather forecasting models. Well, what we understand is that it isn't weather forecasting for civilian purposes. It is for targeting systems, because you don't need a quantum computer for forecasting for civilian purposes, but you do need a quantum computer to be very specific in your strategy and then the execution through your tactics. And the tactics are the weapons system comprised of weather systems. And again, it takes the ability to run many millions of models in a short period of time. And good enough in that scenario of speed is directly appropriate for weapons systems that are derived from the weather itself. And I'll stop there.
Okay. So I think I'm understanding what you're saying. So you're saying that the quantum computers wouldn't necessarily be needed for the day-to-day weather forecasting that gets filtered down to the local level. You're talking about it would be ideal for the weaponization of weather on a global scale.
Absolutely.
Okay. That's what I wasn't quite getting before, but now that makes sense. So, given all of this, what are your impressions, or what do you think of the spiritual side of this? How does that play into all of this?
Well, I can give, from a Christian perspective, I can give you a very tangible example of the spiritual mechanisms that are at work here. Because it's too easy to say, oh, well, this is Luciferian. This is from the pit of hell. This is, demonic influences. And it's like, okay, well, what does that really mean in a practical example? Give me some nuts and bolts I can wrap my head around. Well, there is a group of arts known as the Mantic arts, M-A-N-T-I-C. It goes way back thousands of years in human recorded history. The Mantic arts, one in particular, is relevant to the discussion we're having tonight on computing, and that is a divination, a divinatory process that is known as geomancy. In the Arabic, it's called the Ilm al-Ramal, the science of the sand. That's Geomancy, geomancy, if you want to look that up. Geomancy is a binary system of generating numbers randomly. It's called a random number generation system. And there are 16 basic figures that are generated from a random process of number generation. And from that, in the binary system, you are then able, if you're a skilled diviner in geomancy, you're able to foretell the future, which is what divination is all about. It's divining the future. D-I-V-I-N-I-N-G, divining. The point here is that all computer systems, classical transistor, quantum qubit-based, are all binary. And they have their origins in the spiritual practice of geomancy. Geomancy is communicating with fallen angels. And the fallen angels are providing the information by which the diviner is forecasting, predicting, divining the future. Now, this is replete in history, in the scholarly works, and it's even presented in the Bible, that this was a common practice. We can talk about people like Daniel, for example, in the Bible. But this is a common practice in the administration of kingdoms and the directing of armies to battle, and looking at what are known as, let's call them the appropriate time to do something and the inappropriate time to do something. And this can go down to an individual's level. Should my fiance and I get married on the 30th of the month, or should it be on the 15th? I mean, everyday walk of life, geomancy played a role, including the administration of kingdoms. So what I'm saying here in a nutshell is that this is a forbidden art, forbidden by God, because it is an art that is employed to communicate with fallen angels. Rolling forward to the present time, exactly the same mantic art, geomancy, has always been at play, has always been the basic operating system of classical and now quantum computers, because all of the software is based on binary. So I encourage the audience to look into geomancy. Don't have time tonight to go through a full explanation of it. I've done many, many live streams on this for my patrons through Patreon. But the point here is that this is a spiritual mechanism. It is, if you will, a nuts and bolts system, including computers today. And to speak directly about quantum computing, it has mechanized and sped up geomancy. it's still geomancy. It is still interdimensional communication with fallen angels. And that's the spiritual influence that is at work here today. Go ahead, sir.
No, I was just going to say, most people have probably heard of casting of lots, the casting of lots, which is basically with a dice, right? With die.
Right.
Yeah. So quantum computing is casting lots, just on a mega scale, I guess, to some degree.
Absolutely. At the core of it, think of it this way. It's random number generation. And from random number generation, you produce models. And those models give you the ability to forecast the future. And therein is the simplest, most concise description I can give you for the application of quantum computers, random number generation, for the production of models for forecasting the future that applies to the weaponization of the weather on this planet.
Wow. So who are the humans, the geoengineers then? Who are they communicating with? Are they communicating with the governors or the fallen angels? Right. Okay.
Yep. In the grouping of fallen angels, there literally is a hierarchy. There is a pyramid, okay?
Yep.
It sounds funny, but there is a pyramidal organizational chart. At the top of that are known as the governors. And those governors, they govern the other fallen angels. And below the fallen angels, of course, we have the proliferation of demonic entities, the demons themselves. And so the communication, as an example for people to think beyond that, maybe I'm just making this up, the familiar characters to your audience here, it would be people like John Dee and Edward Kelly in the Renaissance period, who communicated using geomancy with the governors. We have, in the 12th century in Spain, we have Ramon Lull. That's Lull, Ramon Lull. And Ramon Lull took geomancy and advanced it, still communicating with the governors of the fallen angels, to he coined the phrase combinatorial optimization in the 12th century. And that same, as I mentioned earlier, concept, that operating system of combinatorial optimization used in the 12th century is what D-Wave is using as their operating system today. So that definitely is a link that they are communicating with the governors. So John Dee and Edward Kelly, 250 different books they produced on all of these communications and the information they derived and the systems that they derived. Aleister Crowley and Madame Blavatsky in the more modern era absolutely based their operating in the communication with the governors on the shoulders of Dee and Kelly and Ramon Lull, and on up to the turn of the century. So it's all about interdimensional communication through forbidden arts with the fallen angels.
Wow. So you're saying, too, then, that the quantum computers are a physical representation, essentially proving everything in the Bible to be exactly right. That's what it sounds like.
I would agree with you. I would absolutely agree with you. The divination is forbidden in Scripture.
Yeah.
The casting of lots is not done anymore. It was done in the time of Jesus. It was still a practice, but another example that I mentioned earlier was Daniel, and after he provided the interpretation of the dream, God told Daniel, seal up the books. He was telling him, you don't need to continue with the divinatory practice of geomancy anymore. The interpretation of the dream was done through geomancy.
Wow. So the geoengineers are doing the bidding then. They're doing the bidding of the fallen angels.
They are, because another thing to appreciate about the governors is that the governors are given dominion. They're given power over air, we would include wind in that, fire or heat, and they are given dominion over the earth itself. The basic elements of our environment, the governors are given dominion over. In other words, they can physically alter what I like to call terraforming. They can physically alter, they can influence the weather and the earth itself. So if we go to things like tectonic activity and volcanism, it sounds preposterous in the modern era right now to think that there are spiritual entities that could modify the weather, that could cause earthquakes, that could cause volcanism, volcanoes. But if you look at the scholarly works, if you look at the textbooks, you don't have to get into the dark arts to see this. It is replete in the scholarly records that the governors have the authority to modify our environment. What is required is there has to be communication between them and humans. And there's a direct influence by way of the governors on those elements. But there's also the indirect, which is the giving of information to humans, forbidden knowledge, to then build out the technologies, what I call the evidence of evil, the technologies that modify the elements. So they work concurrently, hand in hand. The governors are spiritually influencing, humans are physically influencing, and you've heard me say this many, many times. You cannot separate the physical from the spiritual. They work hand in hand.
Yeah, and the quantum computer aspect of it is linking the two. It's linking our world to that world, and then allowing the manipulation of all of those elements that you're talking about. At least
that's
the weather
correct.
aspect.
If you look at the alchemists, which Dean Kelly and Ramon Lull were in that category of alchemists, this is the whole thing of the alchemists, is they are spiritually communicating, and they're given instructions on how to change the physical. While at the same time, the governors are spiritually influencing those elements themselves. It's a force that acts upon the physical from the governors, from the spiritual realm. Excuse me.
So it sounds to me too then that the quantum computers are then helping, to some degree at least, to terraform the planet, like you talk about.
Absolutely they are. Because they are it sounds a little silly for me to say this, but I'll say it anyway. It's like an interdimensional telephone system. Because the information flow now, as compared to in the historical record, in the ancient times, in the time of Daniel, for example, the information flow is so much greater because we have the technologies that we have been guided, that we've been instructed on how to build, so that would increase the amount, the quantity, and the speed of that information coming through. The result of that has been these earth changes that we're seeing. I think that the bulk of what is going on this planet is because of this interdimensional communication, as opposed to thinking it was just invented by man. It was just man's creativity and inventiveness that came up with all these things. It's not the case. It's a small percentage, but it's not the overwhelming case. The real case is the interdimensional spiritual communication, providing the guidance on building out the technologies and the systems.
Okay, and then would it be safe to say too then that the forever upgrades that you get as a D-Wave customer and the doubling of the doubling that you talk about in the live streams, things are probably only going to get worse from here, from a geoengineering aspect at least?
Absolutely. And all we have to do is look at the book of Revelation to know that it's not going to get any better.
Yeah.
But to kind of sidestep away from the Bible for a moment, I would say this. Would there be a point in time where those that are pushing the agenda of geoengineering would suddenly stop and say, oops, we made a mistake, or oops, we've done enough. Okay, we've reached our goal. We're going to put away all of our toys, all of our systems, and we're not going to do any of this anymore. We're just going to let the earth be the earth. Well, we know that that's absurd. Yeah. They're not going to stop. So the answer is self-evident, and I'm not belittling what you said. I'm simply agreeing with you that it's only going to get worse.
Yep. Yeah, they wouldn't know when to stop. It's all about power and control. And
as Dane, so often points out, and I love his research and his ability to present so well his research.
Yeah. Yep.
He has said that it is now this endless feedback loop, and I'm paraphrasing, but this feedback system now where they're seeing outcomes that are not what they desire, so they try to counter that by increasing that which they did that created the problem in the first place.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, so, it's just a treadmill that just goes faster and faster and faster.
Exactly.
Well, I would say that God is bringing all hidden secrets out now, and he's revealing the truth about subjects like this for people who are willing to listen. So I thank you so much for your valuable time in explaining this to people, and I hope people will take it to the Lord in prayer. I hope that people will understand that what we are seeing in our skies is a direct result of the spiritual and the physical being combined.
Well, I agree with you, my friend, and I thank you for all that you have done in the almost 3 years we've been together doing these live streams. And, your expertise is what I rely on in a whole host of areas of what I'm doing, not just the live streams, but, with the website as well. And so, you've helped me as you've helped Dane at a professional level to be able to get the messages out there to our respective audiences. And I'll just put this out to you. I'm more than happy to continue these conversations with you for the benefit of Dane's audience. If that is of interest to Dane and of interest to you, I'm happy to do this, because there's obviously a lot more we could talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like this is really chapter 1, but man, it's a big one, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Anthony. And please, if you haven't been to Anthony's website, go to anthonypatch.com and support him as a patron. You will get a lot of really great information on a monthly basis, on a daily basis from him, from the live streams that he does 3 times a week, Sundays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, to the really great magazine that he puts out monthly, Entangled Magazine. If you're really interested in this type of research, Anthony's the guy. So definitely go check out his website and consider becoming a patron on patreon.com. So it's patreon.com/AnthonyPatch. So thank you again for your time, Anthony, and we will talk again soon, my friend.
All righty. God bless you, and God bless everybody in the audience. Good night.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for joining us today in our discussion with Anthony Patch and his incredible research into quantum computers and quantum mechanics, into CERN as well, and DNA and blockchain and artificial intelligence, you name it. Anthony makes the hard to understand and esoteric much more easily understandable. So please visit anthonypatch.com for more information and support his great work. Thanks again for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.